Okay. Good afternoon and welcome back to this last but definitely not least panel of thinking about time. And the panel is called Art, Activism and Mediation. Technology, of course, has always influenced the way we perceive and think about time and the way we experience time. Whether we're thinking about how artworks are mediated temporally or recorded and stored back to us, events, it definitely changes how we experience temporal events. Especially with the advent of the internet and social media, we always feel that we are supposed to experience events in real time, even after the facts. And within an activist framework particularly, the momentum and the congruence between time and technology are seminal in order to achieve a certain impact. This is particularly potent if we think about the events of 2011, the uprisings in the region, but also Gezi Park is a good example. As befitting a panel on mediation, Eric Kluitenberg here on Skype, joining us from Amsterdam, will be presenting remotely. Eric is a theoretician, a writer, and an educator working at the intersection of culture, politics, media, and technology. He is a research fellow at the Institute of Network Cultures in Amsterdam and was head of the media program at the Valley in Amsterdam Center for Culture and Politics. He has published several books, specifically on tactical media, and is now working on an international anthology of tactical media together with David Garcia, to be published in 2016 by the MIT Press. I'm also proud to say that Eric and I and David are collaborating on an event in 2016, an exhibition and a set of public events specifically on the historical legacy of tactical media. His presentation is titled Capturing the Ephemeral and the Contestational on the Collision of Living Moments and Frozen Statements. Eric, over to you in Amsterdam.
Okay. Thank you very much also for the kind introduction. Are you hearing me properly now?
Yes.
Yeah. So we will be running through a number of slides, and what I did is write them out a little bit more than I would usually do, because with Skype connection sometimes it cuts out for just a word or two, and then you can still hopefully follow the whole story, despite the fact that maybe there might be some slight interruption, so I hope it works. I'm desperately sorry, first of all, I must say that I'm not in Beirut. That was entirely the intention, and everything was ready, but a medical emergency in the family prevented me from leaving Amsterdam. Luckily, the situation is not as bad as we feared. But it did prevent me from leaving, so that was inevitable and very unfortunate. So we decided that we would try this remote presentation, and I hope it will keep on working. It seems to work fine now. So if we can move to the slides, just the starting slide, the very first one.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, you not already introduced the title, and what you see here, this image, is one of the more striking images, I would say, that came out of the Brazilian protests of a few years ago. I think 2 years ago by now. That mostly targeted failing social policies in Brazil. And there was a group that acquired quite some notoriety, widely covered in international media, including The Guardian newspaper, for instance, wrote more than one piece about it, called Media Ninjas. And the Media Ninjas was basically a group of media activists from different backgrounds, media professionals, artists, and others who were documenting police brutality during these protests and then brought these to the wider public domain in order to provide basically visual evidence of these kind of violations of Brazilian law by the police. And they were also pursuing a legal action against the officers who were involved in these kind of illegal acts. So this was quite an interesting thing. Now, I need to say also that meanwhile, I've already heard some discontent also from activist circles in Brazil saying these protests were very massive and widely distributed events with a large variety of people convening in these events, and media ninjas became too much a media icon of this movement. So I need to put this caveat to the image. But what it illustrates very beautifully, also in sort of the layering in this image, where you see the mobile phone with cracked glass. You see the social media interface, the live feeds that are happening from the streets. At the same time, the camera very classically capturing or witnessing the moment. So it is a kind of, at the same time, embodies something that we used to call tactical media, which was a concept which I will get to the next slide. For the moment, stay here, which we used in the 1990s to describe this turnaround of the medium, in the sense that the medium no longer captures from the outside through some kind of professional and distant gaze, but instead it is taken into the hands of the people who are actually participating in the event, and they use the media to express whatever point they want to make in the wider public domain. Usually this is an expression of groups who feel that they are somehow excluded or they are somehow misrepresented in the wider public domain. So this is the kind of turnaround that happened with this tactical media idea. That is now reappearing in these kind of settings, but of course without any of the people who are involved necessarily thinking about this as tactical media. I think it's a very particular characteristic of time. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, so here you see two of the classical images. One is the visual item that was created for the second Next 5 Minutes Festival in Amsterdam. This festival series, which happened between 1993 and 2003, 4 editions in total, was crucial in identifying this, what we could call a cluster of critical practices. We'll get to that in the next slide. And sort of articulate this concept of tactical media, and we'll say a bit more about it. And the other image is from a slightly later book from 2001 by Critical Art Ensemble called Digital Resistance, which is very much a reflection on tactical media after already some years of debate and practice, festivals and meetings had taken place. And it is, of course, a very nice condensation of this idea of media moving into public space on the one hand, and the iconography of the protester, very much reminiscent of Bob Dylan's iconic kind of pop video. The times, they are changing, and very much repeated in all the street protests that we've seen since 2011. So I thought it was a striking image there. Next slide. Yeah. With the next slide. Yeah, this one. So tactical media can be described as a cluster of critical practices at the intersection of art, media, political activism, and technological experimentation. So these elements typically came together in the kind of projects and groups and activities that met up in these Next 5 Minutes festivals at the time. And as said, these festivals were quite crucial in identifying this practice. So if we go to the next slide. Yeah, I'm talking about the cluster of critical practices because there is a lot of suspicion about the term movement in relation to tactical media. It was more at the time that a certain logic, a new way of working, was identified across a large number of different fields, both in art practice as well as in political activism, as well as in people who were somehow promoting dissident lifestyles in a wider public domain. And these kind of similarities in practice were recognized, but it never really formally became a movement. So it was always a slightly ephemeral phenomenon, very much in line with the ephemerality that is characteristic of the kind of events that we are talking about, which are usually very intense, but usually also very short-lived. And this event character is extremely important in the case of tactical media. Nonetheless, there is a text that everybody refers to, which you could call a kind of founding manifesto of this phenomenon, this cluster, the ABC of tactical media, which was written in 1997, so between the second and third Next 5 Minutes conference by Kate Loving and David Garcia. And just to reiterate some of the opening sentences of that manifesto, because they very precisely capture what this phenomenon is about. So what they say is that tactical media is what happens when these kind of do-it-yourself media that have become available in the consumer marketplace and all kinds of new forms of distribution of media forms, public access cable, which was very important in the 90s, and then slowly the internet became more and more important as a distribution media. And you should keep in mind also that up until the very late 90s it was basically not possible to transmit video of the internet, so that's why these kind of forms of public access cable TV were very important to create this presence of these groups who felt somehow excluded from the wider public domain. And as it says in this sentence, exploited by groups and individuals who feel aggrieved or excluded from the wider culture. Now, very important within this Garcia and Loving note is that tactical media never just report like professional media do, but they are always directly involved in the events that are being mediated. So they are never impartial, and they are always participatory in character. And then the other, of course, important characteristic is that tactical media are never neutral forms of media production, but they are media of crisis, and they are media of criticism and of opposition. This is something that connects all these different experiences and all these different practices and practitioners together, both, I would say, from this period of the 90s when this field was articulated, right up to the recent very densely media-saturated forms of protest that we've seen in the last few years. Okay, next slide. So, if we look at these kind of events which this logic typically manifests itself, then what is quite obviously very important here is the vitality and the intensity of this event, of what we could call the living moment. And tactical media and its practices find their vitality in moments of crisis, as I said before. And this vitality is found through the participation, and this I would say would be also quite a crucial dimension here, of the body of the protest. So this kind of physical involvement, sort of overlayered and continuously interacting with the media layer, is very much essential here. And while I can't go into this because it's a big discussion, there is this affective dimension to this which is incredibly important. If you want to know a little bit more about my recent research on the affective resonance patterns in these kind of dense gatherings, you can actually read it online because a new essay has been published by the Open online platform for art in the public domain, onlineopen.org from memory, called Affect Space. So you can read up a little bit more about that if you are interested in this particular dimension. Now, what I want to show as an image here at the bottom is a picture, a photograph of Tahrir Cinema, which was a project that was executed right in the middle of the original Tahrir Square occupation. And we did an event in late in 2011 in which Nadia was also involved as co-organizer and co-editor of this event, one-day conference and some associated activities. And Egyptian filmmaker Robert Omar Hamilton came over to Amsterdam and gave a particularly impressive presentation about his experience in the middle of these protests as a filmmaker and media professional. And working together with a group of other artists, writers, actors, so mostly cultural professionals, who set up a media tent on the square, help people to produce their own media, teach them the most basic skills, like keeping your camera still is better for the final image that you get. And then they did this absolutely remarkable thing. They put up a big screen in the middle of the square, and they showed the footage that people were bringing into the media tent, so the footage produced by the protesters themselves, to the protest. So if you see in this image that this is a massive gathering, that there must be at least 1,000 people watching this simultaneously. So it's a very interesting form of reflection that happens here between the immediacy of the event and all these effective exchanges that happen there, this enormous vitality of this moment, and it's almost immediate mediation and self-reflection on the screen. I thought that was an absolutely remarkable project. And it's all the more moving, I would say, because we know the terrible aftermath of these protests and the political predicament that we are still in as a result of it. Okay, next slide. Now, the question that we've also been asking ourselves is what to do now that this festival series was over. In 2003 we had the feeling that what we could achieve with the Next 5 Minutes Festival had all been achieved, that more and more capacities for people to produce their own media distributed on their own terms had emerged. And that as a result of that, the need for such a festival didn't seem to be so urgently required as before, that it had somehow exhausted itself in the sense that everything was achieved, that festival, that particular meeting could achieve, that from here onwards, this thing, this new logic of media production and distribution and reception would become so massive that it's ridiculous to think that you can still capture this in the format of a festival, but it should spread and diversify in all directions and across many territories, as we know now has happened on a scale much more massively than we ever could have imagined in the 90s and even in 2003 we were hardly aware of. Nonetheless, people kept on asking us for at least another 6 years if we would do another festival connected to tactical media, another edition of the next 5 minutes. And this raised with us the question, well, what are we going to do with the memory of this enormous vitality that also existed in the 1990s, for instance, with the fall of the focus of genes in most of Central, Eastern and Southeastern Europe, where a large variety of artists and media groups very actively were engaged in transformation in the society. So this is a kind of vitality that was very strong in these original Next 5 Minutes editions, but there were also very strong sections of Palestinian media production, or for instance groups from Latin America who were making tactical television. And all these memories somehow were only present at some point in the heads of those people that actually participated in these events, but were increasingly disappearing from other spaces. There were no professional activities going on documenting this kind of activity. So slowly we started to think we need some kind of documentation resource to at least retain some kind of memory of these events, and that with that comes the immediate, very problematic question of the archive. So how does, is documentation, is that then an archive? We couldn't imagine that. Because the archive seemed to us the very contradiction of everything that was embodied in this tactical media phenomenon. And this becomes particularly poignant, let's say, and pressing when you consider this enormous vitality of these events, and where the temporality of the event is very much in its immediacy, the immediate connections that are formed in these moments of crisis. Whereas the archive would be, in its temporal dimension, very much defined by atemporality. So the temporality of the archive is atemporality, which is the very obvious opposite of the immediacy of the event. Now, as I say in this slide, this opposition is particularly strong if you look at the archive as a system of rules governing the appearance of definite and clear statements, which are statements that are trying to capture living moments and turning them into what could be called historical events. So this is typically a kind of politics of the archive that has been severely critiqued, and rightfully so, for many years. And the reference that I'm making implicitly in this slide, of course, is to the way that Michel Foucault has described the archive, most prominently in the archaeology of knowledge. So I want to devote a little bit of attention to what he's saying, because it's useful in thinking through this opposition between living moments and the atemporality of the archive. Okay, Next slide. Yeah.
Foucault and the archive, yes.
Yeah. So Foucault and the archive. So in Foucault's own words, I'll read this out literally, the general system of formation and transformation of statements is the most condensed definition of an archive. It's the system that governs the appearance of statements as unique events. And simultaneously for him, it is that which determines that all things said do not accumulate in an amorphous mass. The archive is the system that groups all things said together in distinct figures, which at the outset, at the very root of the statement event, defines what can be expressed in clear and definite terms, or what can be enunciated. The first really important thing about this formal definition of him is that for him the archive is not about documents and objects, but it's about the statements appearing as unique events, as clear as those things that can be expressed in clear and definite terms. So it's a very discursive kind of description of the archive. Next slide, please. So rewriting the archive. So if it's such a discursive idea that contradicts this traditional idea of the archive as a repository of documents and objects we can then expand the idea of the archive to also include museums for that matter, historical museums, storing particular objects that embody certain aspects of the kind of history that is written into the organization of this museum. It's completely transformed into a discursive system which can deal as much with objects and documents as it can deal with clear and definite statements of knowledge, construction of knowledge objects, we could say. Then the question is, how do you engage this notion of the archive, and this notion that the archive is that which defines what can be expressed in clear and definite terms, and therefore excludes everything else which cannot be expressed in terms. So there's a certain violence there implicit in this notion. And it can be engaged actively by uncovering rules that govern the appearance of these statements as unique events, typically the archaeological method, and the appearance of these statements as unique events in the archive, and then trying to modify the rules that make these statements appear as unique events in the archive, in this larger idea of the archive. This is a very complicated thing. This is also well known, of course. Foucault's archaeological method is complicated because it somehow means that we have to dig out the earth, as it were, from under our own feet, since we are always embedded within these systems of clear and definite statements as they appear in the archive. This is how our knowledge is formed and our understanding of the world is informed, and therefore it's never entirely possible to extract yourself from that. Nonetheless, there is a possibility here for a critical engagement, and this critical engagement typically lies not just on the level of which objects are selected and which documents are selected, but mostly on the level of how discourse is formed in relation to these objects and to these documents. And we came up with this title, The Living Archive, to not come up with an anti-archive notion. So we decided to develop a different concept, and this concept we used to start thinking about documentation practice in relation to such phenomena as tactical media. And this living archive notion, which I will turn to now, is a conscious and active engagement with exactly these systems of rules that Foucault has described in the archaeology of knowledge. Okay, next slide. Yeah, just a nice image that is another type of living archive.
Yeah. Yes, we're on that image. Harry?
Yeah.
Yes, we are on the image.
Yeah. So the image is just a short reference. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. So when we started to work on this this notion, we were actually working from the Bali, the Center for Culture and Politics in Amsterdam, and there was a really nice environment to do this because this is a very densely programmed space with hundreds of events per year, a lot of political, social debates, cultural debates, festivals, programs, workshops, seminars, and all kinds of other things, also a lot of art cinema screenings. And already from the late 90s onwards, we have done a lot of experiments with live streaming from the theater space of the Bali, particularly when there were important social, political, or cultural debates happening in that space. So you would, at some point, end up with a situation where there would be something close to 100 or more programs per year recorded in the event space and streamed out live. And so we were thinking about how can we create some kind of documentation structure for this kind of activity. And while working on this, we actually started to work also in parallel on this idea of documentation resource for tactical media. At the time, we had to formulate this idea of how we would approach it. We called it, as said, the living archive. And our working definition was to create a model in which the documentation of living cultural processes, archive materials, ephemera, and discursive practices are interwoven as seamlessly as possible. So we wanted to make this border between the actual processes going on, the archive materials were also from previous events, and the archiving of very ephemeral things like a little discussion or a talk, or some kind of temporary visual identifications, even right up to the level of the flyers for events that usually disappear. We wanted to make this border as thin as possible and as permeable as possible with the actual event and the actual discussion. And also think about how you could extend this discussion over time, so that beyond the event it would continue, and that therefore the archive and the actual conducted conversation and discussion would continuously inform each other. And then, of course, we try to do that by using all kinds of database content management systems and digital audio and video technologies. And here, this live streaming from the event space was very important because this meant that these events would remain accessible in whatever you call it, the archive. So archiving then is understood as a dynamic and open-ended process, so not as a fixed procedure that tries to define clear and definite statements, so very much in opposition to that which is critiqued by Foucault in his archaeology of knowledge. And these should act upon the present and future, upon present and future events, and they are simultaneously acted upon and rewritten by these events and their outcomes, not least the kind of socio-political debates that be happening continuously in this space. So it was very interesting to see how this continuous feedback process between what's happening in the space and continued discussions over time, how that would evolve. Then, of course, the Living Archive is much less concerned with physical memory objects, as a museum would be, and it is much more involved with active engagement of living cultural processes. Okay, next slide. Now, one more theoretical digression, more or less the last, but I think a very essential one. Some German friends brought this German Egyptologist, Jan Assmann, to my attention quite early on. By now, Assmann is quite famous because he coined this term cultural memory. In Assmann's understanding, and it's interesting that this comes from an Egyptologist who really deals with archaeological findings mostly in his regular profession. He understands cultural memory as an active political principle. So very much not a neutral kind of idea, and definitely not something which is a final, definite and clear statement that is more or less frozen in the archive. Much rather, it's an active principle. So it's useful to understand how he sees this notion of cultural memory. So he says, first of all, cultural memory is a kind of connective structure that is used to found group identity through ritual and textual coherence. So this is already an interesting notion, a connective structure that founds group identity. And he explains that the past, in this case, is never remembered for its own sake. It's always remembered, and its main function is to create a sense of continuity. So a sense of continuity between past, present, and thereby also, by extension, the future. And it acts, as he says, as a motor for development. Not just of cultural development, but also political development. He calls these kind of mechanisms that are developed there mythomotorics. So, kind of mythological motorics that are used to mobilize the present and to move it towards some kind of intended future. He also says the present in this notion of cultural memory is situated at the end of a collective path as meaningful, necessary, and unalterable. So it's really an attempt to impose a particular reading of past, present, future, and its unbreakable connections in this mytho narrative, let's say, and implying a necessary course of development. Now, using the memory of the past in this way is very useful for all kinds of forms of authoritarian politics, that's very clear. And it can also serve as a justification for political actions that are taken in the present, and direct groups as a group as homogeneous as possible towards the future. So understanding this notion of cultural memory makes it clear that archiving and the collection of memory objects and the formation of these kind of discourses is anything but innocent or value neutral. we go to the next slide. So it is then inevitable that to think about the critical engagement with this notion of cultural memory. As I said here, a critical engagement and possible deconstruction or intervention into the narration of cultural memory, because this is very much about creating a narrative structure. So it is very discursive in this sense. So this deconstruction or intervention into the narration of cultural memory is an important tactical imperative for the construction of living archives. So in my view, the living archive can, if you want to be true to this notion, can never escape a critical engagement with these processes of the narration of cultural memory. So that was a very important attention point for us as well. Living archives therefore actively engage the construction of mythological cultural narratives with the aim to emphasize the contingency and open-ended character of historical development. So to completely reject this idea of presenting the future as unalterable, because it comes out of a necessary path from past to present. So that logic needs to be broken by the kind of systems that would somehow qualify as living archives. And it also engages the possibilities for active involvement of a variety of actors in the determination of these cultural narratives. So this idea of giving voice to the voiceless, that was very important in tactical media circles. This demand to access to the most vital tools for the production of public culture is also very much a way of including a larger variety, as large as possible variety of actors in the determination of these mythological cultural narratives, in order to break open this idea that there is only one necessary path towards the future. So this is also something that is informing this critical notion of the archive. Okay, next slide. So the technical media files exist as a documentation resource since late 2008, so already quite a while. We have very recently rebuilt the whole backside of this website, this web platform. And the important in that is that we also reconstituted the video archive, which had been dysfunctional for quite some time, but is working and will be extended in the near future. It's always been a very complicated question how to set up this resource. So we cannot claim in any sense to be comprehensive with regards to this enormous field of tactical media. You can capture a lot of what happened in the 1990s, but its extension to the present, it has become such a massive field, as mentioned before, that it's totally impossible to capture that in such a resource. Nonetheless, we try all the time to make a link between these documents from the past that are stored here and the active process, the active practices that are ongoing right now. We also chose a very transparent form of visual design, and yeah, I'm almost there. So the idea is that we try to pursue with this resource a very modest position with regards to documenting these practices, and then proceed from there. Okay, in view of time, I will leave the comments about the resource itself there. In the next half year or year to come, we hope to also start working much more extensively on a redesign of the whole visual side of the website, and we hope to work together with artists to develop more experimental approaches to the materials that are stored there. And one thing that I want to mention there is that we are working now with a young American artist, Robert M. Oxhorn, who is doing really fantastic stuff with very interesting dynamic interfaces to video collections, creating moving mosaics which allow you to navigate in completely new ways through massive collections of video. And we will work together with him, and this is really something to look forward to when we get to the point of releasing this to the public. Okay, so I want to close with two things. A short video that was released by the Moserine Collective from Cairo, that formed out of the initial Tahrir Square occupation and the media activities that I alluded to before with Tahrir Cinema that happened in the middle of these protests. They are now an independent media center in the central Cairo, and when the Gezi Park protest started in Turkey in the middle of 2014, they came out with this video statement saying, from Tahrir to Taksim, we demand the fall of the system. Very overtly and explicitly political video, but what is really interesting about it is two things. First of all, the enormous vitality, which is very apparent in this video and very graphically present there. It's also partly unpleasant to watch, which to me signifies how difficult it is to capture something this intense in something which was formerly called an archive or a documentation resource or a living archive. So this video really makes very clear the contradictions that are strong, and you can sense them much more visually. The other thing is that they made an interesting split-screen montage in which they put images of the protests in Cairo and images of the protests in Turkey side by side and started to map out similarities. And it's a very interesting statement of solidarity between these two very different spaces. So let's watch this video briefly.
Ağaçlara geldi, gezdi ağaçlara sarıldı, gençlerden bazıları. Ağaçlar süpürünce, gençler ağaçların sesi oldu, imdat dedi. Sırtını yandı, oturmuş, gezini kaldırdı.
Yeah. So the final remarks that I wanted to make about this is the video speaks for itself. So for me, the collision between the frozen statements of the archives and the intensity and vitality of the event is so clear in this document that it doesn't need much further elaboration. But what we found quite early on when we started to work on this process is that this kind of critical discursive engagement of the archive that we wanted, including its atemporality, could never be only organized online. And actually we did try. So we did build all kinds of forum systems. We created situations where people could respond in all kinds of ways live to events as they were uncovering. We did a very interesting event when there was a big fire in the asylum seekers detention center in Schiphol, and 11 people died in the fire. It was a huge scandal in Dutch politics, and there was a very intense, long evening organized in the space of the Bouwhuis, where people were debating this from all kinds of sides, where also some of the former people who had been in detention in asylum seekers center themselves were present, politicians were present, and where this thing was happening simultaneously in the space on the internet and on local television, and people could react via all kinds of media at the same time. So we developed all these kind of methods, technically and in terms of events. But we still felt that this online dimension could never be sufficient. So we understood that offline encounters and debates are a necessary part of such a living archive, that you can't do without them. So therefore, we consider this organizing of events, which we are doing every now and then, as part of our so-called documentation activity. It is part of the active discursive engagement and reinterpretation which is required. And the second thing that we really feel must be emphasized here is that the living archive, as we've defined it here, does not exist. There is simply no existing model that would meet even the most basic requirements for a living archive, including Wikipedia, which is very much a documentation resource that is very collectively created with a lot of debate and everything around it. But one of the things that we find, impossible to deal with in the case of Wikipedia is the neutral point of view, which is untenable in relation to the things that we've just discussed, and that as a final thought, perhaps this impossible demand is exactly the point of this activity, that there shouldn't be a resolution to this question. That's it. Okay.
Thank you, Eric. With us now on Skype, we thought we'd do the Q&A now. And Eric, perhaps I'll start with the first question. You spoke about how tactical media and these critical practices started around the 90s, so that's almost a time span of 20 years. And perhaps it's a bit of an unfair question, but looking in hindsight and looking at the practices then, vis-a-vis the practices you see now, what kind of differences can you discern in terms of tactical practices, or how groups and individuals work? Because of course now we use these types of media all the time, they're ubiquitous.
I think that's the main issue here, is that you could say that much of this activity originated in the 1980s already, but there are all kinds of forms of community television at first, and then more and more groups becoming increasingly autonomous in their approach to the media. So in the very first edition of the Next 5 Minutes festival in '93, it was even called tactical television. So the notion of media came only later, the notion of internet yet later. And so you could also imagine that the groups that were doing this were very conscious. You know, they were very consciously engaged, and they had all kinds of ideas and articulations about this. Whereas, right, the situation now is that almost anybody who wants to, and massive numbers of people, millions and millions literally, engaging in activities that could be labeled as tactical media if you would follow the guidelines of, for instance, ABC of tactical media and other things, but where nobody thinks about this notion or ever heard about it. So it's become completely self-evident. There is a protest, there's something I don't like, and people immediately pick up the phone, and especially the integration of video in mobile phones has, of course, exponentially increased this dynamic. But the consciousness of that action is only very limitedly, in a limited form there. So it is a really interesting change in dynamics, and you see that the activists are struggling with that because when activists very consciously do want to do something, they are submerged in this enormous avalanche of production that is happening and that is accompanying these events and turns them into such dense gatherings that they become, to some extent, unfocused, and to some extent also very unpredictable in their dynamics. So this is also something that's very different from what happened in the 90s. And then therefore, all the more reason that this debate should be conducted now, very critical.
I'd like to see if there are any questions from the audience for Eric.
Yes, it's Eric.
Okay, then I have another question, perhaps. You spoke about the effective resonance, and I know you just published a paper about this, but perhaps you can just really shortly unpack this notion of the body vis-a-vis the protesters and what you actually mean by it.
Yeah, well, you know, this is a big discussion, and I already took up quite a bit of time, so I won't go very deeply into it, but there's something where this becomes, I think, very apparent, and that is that, that we see that this recurrent pattern, and we've seen it also in all these massive events since 2011, but even before that, that quite often there's a mobilization happening which starts online or has a strong online dimension in the initial stages. So also if you look, for instance, at the Gezi Park protest, there were maybe 100, 150 people on the street. When it started and the police brutality happened, they cracked down on the little protest very fiercely. That was immediately tweeted via Twitter streams and then started to proliferate on all kinds of other channels. And this mediated presence immediately mushroomed the protest. So it had an enormous attractive power, let's say. And what happens is that people watch this and their screens, they feel rather that it's rather difficult to engage with this in situations where there is already a tense political situation that's in in many places. People will feel a certain need to do something with the energy that is generated. This energy is very much an affective energy also. And this energy is not just something that is consciously perceived, but it's, I think, a lot of people to go into the streets. But once they enter into the streets, and particularly if a protest starts to mushroom, like what happened around the Gezi Park protest, they enter into an even much more intense situation where the gathering of different bodies in close proximity leads to all kinds of affective exchanges that go far beyond the initial reason of the protest. So you start to see some kind of autonomous dynamic in these situations. But what is very interesting now in the current environment that we are in is that there's at the same time this proliferation of mobile and wireless technology also in public space. So that as soon as these kind of things start to happen in public space, they are immediately retransmitted again into the media network. So you get this kind of feedback loop. It's first on the street, then it goes to the network, then more come into the street, then more sent into the network. And this kind of dynamic is something that we've seen over and over again. This physical dimension is very much crucial in driving from one stage to the other. And at the same time, it's a very unpredictable pattern. And it's a pattern that we also don't really understand very well. So I've been approaching this mostly via affect theory as a theoretical framework, and very classically via the ideas of Brian Massumi, which sort of also loosely bases itself on new findings in the neurosciences. But I must say rather loosely, there's also some critique obviously of protagonists of this particular theoretical framework. But this is an area where our understanding is only very partial at the moment. And I think this is where I see important space of critical reflection now.
All right. If there are no burning questions from the audience, I'm just scanning. Then thank you so much for joining us, Eric.
Yeah.
And if you're linger on maybe for Brian's presentation, but if not, thanks for joining us from Amsterdam.
Yeah, I'll see if I can follow. Okay.
Bye. Ciao.
Bye.
Okay, so from real time in Amsterdam back to Beirut, I'm happy to introduce Brian William Rogers. Brian is a writer and artist living between Los Angeles and Beirut, and has exhibited internationally, and is currently a doctoral candidate in film, digital art, and new media at the University of California in Santa Cruz. Brian's paper is titled "Emancipation is a Time Relation," in which he will explore how contemporary finance instruments are perhaps the most forcefully future-oriented media for the binding and manipulation of time.
My particular point of entry for addressing the concerns of the conference really has less to do with specific artworks or generalized ontologies of time, and more to do with the geometries of interaction between the various socio-temporal dimensions of art's production and the contemporary political economy that both conditions art's production and which art reperforms according to its own local exigencies. The order to which these formations belong is best described as risk relations. In his recent essay, The Ontology of Finance, Price, Power, and the Arc of Derivative, Suhail Malik, drawing upon the work of Elena Esposito, argues that modernity qua finance, namely the consequences of the complex financial instruments of the derivatives market, compels us to reconsider how time, including futurity, is materially instantiated in the present. Malik identifies the material practice of contemporary time according to the following. 1, the system specificity of time binding, or the relation between the actual and the inactual, means that in effect we are never directly dealing with or confronting such a thing as a global total time. 2, time is specific to a system, produced in order to organize and complexify that system's operations. 3, the complexification of a system's time allows it to structure its present operations in view of what it is not yet. 4, the anticipation of the future in the present takes into account the contingency of the future. And 5, operators in a system understand that they can make decisions for an anticipated future which, while itself unknown, permits the freedom to decide differently once that future has become present. And finally, operations from the present but in the future condition the future but do not determine it. Malik's theorization of the time-binding practices is in direct reference to financial derivatives. While the intricacies of the derivatives market is beyond the purview of this talk, a general understanding of their function as a technology of both the present and the future, and what that function means for us who supposedly have no relation to these abstract financial instruments, is necessary. This can also be thought of as what Malik refers to as the coeval construction of social and temporal uncertainties, that is, modernity. The gains to be made in the derivatives market are only tangentially or nominally related to the underlying assets that they index. That is, derivatives generate capital in terms of their relation to the future. And so, essentially, derivatives are financial agreements that hedge the risks of uncertain events. So the most simple form of the derivative, but there's a whole bestiary of very complex iterations of derivatives, is something called the call option. So a call option gives the buyer of a stock a right to buy shares of a certain stock at a predetermined price, no matter what happens in the future. There's another type of derivative called a put, which can be purchased by traders in order to ensure that they will be paid the full price for their shares in the future, even if the value of that stock drops below the original price. And a more common kind of banal example would be something like the purchasing of an insurance plan. You pay a certain amount, fixed amount of money to ensure that if a catastrophe occurs in the future, the insurance company will pay out the rest of the cost of the disaster. So essentially, derivatives name a price for the future, not knowing what the future may hold, but minimally and flexibly bound to past behaviors and trends. So, as has been demonstrated in the years since 2008, the volatility of the future of the market, including sudden, large market crashes, is not just afforded by risk relationality. Risk relationality thrives on volatility. Large-scale catastrophes only serve as opportunities to reinforce ordering power. The more threatening the future seems, the more expensive it becomes. Thus, it can be said that the derivatives market, which on average is triple the average GDP in a country like the US, asymmetrically binds our present time with the price of the future. Like all other forms of time binding, the time binding of derivatives finance has a social cost, which Malik identifies as a terminal game of risk. In derivative, time-binding relationships are made, maintained, and reconfigured in relation to the uncertainty of the future in the present. The current constraint, writes Malik, which should neutralize future uncertainties, comes to depend on these same uncertainties, making the ordering itself uncertain in its binding and depriving the social order of the very meaning of a fixed normativity. Risk societies have weak social bonds. They're flexible and adaptable. It's not a situation completely bereft of norms and social contracts. Risks are taken not in order to control, plan, or determine the future, but to control the construction of the possibilities for the future without knowing or having to know which exact possibilities will eventually actualize. So this is a very general sketch of the society at risk. So I want to bring the conversation back around to the types of time binding that are operative in contemporary art, both as a genre, but also as a very particular localized social sphere. So both Malik and Peter Osborne, I think they've quite persuasively agreed that in order to mount a meaningful critique of contemporary art, we need to understand contemporary art, not just art that is happening in the current moment, but as a genre unto itself, and also as a social phenomenon resembling something like a sovereign nation state. So what characterizes the genre of contemporary art? So among other things, it's often referred to by both its practitioners and its critics as indeterminate, open-ended, subjective, flexible, completed by the observer, leaving space for the viewer, open to interpretation, and yet, in the same breath, contemporary art is also oddly claimed to be determinate. Its complicity with continental philosophy, academia, and the market more generally are deployed obsessively as an ontological alibi for its existence. That's as if to say, the acts of conception operative in contemporary artistic practice, the propositions made by contemporary artworks, are only intelligible or valid inasmuch as they can be verified by extensive master disciplines, except don't expect art to be beholden to the same types of standards, rigor, or criteria that those disciplines are. Artists know what they do best, we promise. And more to the point, in the years since Documenta 11 and Archive Fever, the materiality of time, specifically the imaging of the future, has undergone a veritable bull market pricing. Perhaps the most ubiquitous formulation of thinking temporality in contemporary art has been the following methodology. Archival materials from the past are deployed or re-narrated in the present in order to meditate on the potentialities of the future. In this sense, the content of art strives for the kind of time-binding futurity of the derivatives market, but largely falls short and has no real capital to gain options or purchase on the future. In The Blank Swan, former derivatives trader Ali Ayash suggests that debt and ruins are somehow synonymous with one another. And what is not the paradigmatic location for contemporary art concerned with temporality, but the ruin and the ruin's discursive metonym, the archive. One could say that contemporary art's inability to engage in non-trivial future building and or time binding is due, in part, to the debt crisis in which contemporary art finds itself embroiled, attempting to auction off subprime ruins in order to fund a future it still can't afford. From an art historical perspective, this tendency of contemporary art maps onto the transition from neoclassical economics to neoliberalism. In the realm of art practice, this cashes out as the transition from art attempting to reconfigure contemporary time binding to time binding becoming a nominal subject of art. Contemporary art can gesture towards it, inquire into it, interrogate the representations of its history, but it remains mostly incapable of a formidable intervention in this process. Again, this is something like the transition of art's practical efficacy to the valorization of its metaphorical efficacy. But here's the problem. The future is not only a discursive issue, and contemporary art's insistence upon futurity as a primarily discursive phenomenon divests it from a deeper repertoire that would enable it to begin to make good on its claims. Okay. So I think what's even more important to consider is the actual social time binding operative in contemporary art, but which is not necessarily considered to be the content of art per se. It's everything probably but the content. So those two terms are obviously not independent of one another. The geometries of art sociality directly condition how and why artworks assume their precise form. And moreover, it's clear that the concept of the autonomy or sovereignty of artworks is a contingent, relatively small aberration in the long history of art practice. Particularly now, artworks are as much constituted by their circulation, discussion, and influence as they are by their material instantiation. For example, what are we supposed to do with how sometimes a single 140 character or less tweet about an artwork is far more interesting than the artwork itself? So with that in mind, I want to turn attention to the time binding of contemporary art sociality. So what constitutes the social and contemporary art? It's a list of actors that everyone here is familiar with. Universities, museums, galleries, so-called para-academic formations, art fairs, print and online journalism, and of course all of these populated by both formal and informal configurations of artists, curators, administrators, writers, collectors, and so on. So it's in the operations amongst and between these operators that contemporary art finds its deepest resonance with the logics of contemporary finance. Society is at risk. While all of the aforementioned institutions have, at one time or another, avowed their mission to construct spaces for the circulation and production of art that are somehow insulated from the contingencies and demands of the financial market at large, the reality is not so. In fact, what we repeatedly witness is the reproduction of financialized time binding within these institutions. Such is the case for at least the following two related reasons. One, the diaspora of contemporary art institutions, in claiming to be shields against the market, wind up rendering themselves black boxes under the sign of refuge. The a priori assumption that alternative art institutions must be doing something other than what they set themselves up in opposition against is, time and again, borne out to be false. And true, too, it is true, but two, this discursive camouflage effectively renders opaque, unsaid, but nevertheless known by everyone involved, that the actually existing time binding of contemporary art's own risk relations. And speaking of things that everybody involved in contemporary art knows but rarely talks about, art is an exceptionally expensive game to play. Expensive enough that increasingly to have the opportunity to try to partake in art at both local and global levels requires one to be of some other kinds of means. To take but a few mundane examples, think of the following as some of the necessary authorizations in order to play the game of blue-chip contemporary art. The ability to work like an artist but speak like a critic, which would require one to attend one from the small cluster of universities whose students may or may not to go on to become profitable artists, which would then in turn require the continual domestic and international travel to and from the circuit of global art fairs and biennales in order to actually attend the after parties where the real alliances are codified, complicities are forged, and deals are made. For a person who does not come from means, or who has not had the good fortune of being otherwise socialized into the rituals of contemporary art, meeting any single one of these requirements is a near impossibility. Moreover, working in order to be able to do these things is often regarded as somehow the mark of those who are not meant to be inducted. All of this is then exacerbated by the highly volatile nature of art's market, raising the social precarity of contemporary art to exceptionally fierce levels. What one winds up facing is what Malik describes as the essential cartel-like nature of contemporary art. What is the nature of this cartel? Well, like all cartels, it's undergirded by immense amounts of private and public wealth, to the extent that this is even a cogent distinction anymore, whose origins are not disclosed, and like all cartels, its executive decisions nominally operate according to a code, but which more often than not are subject to volatile, contingent symmetry breakings. So if we understand the derivatives derived relation to futurity to be not one in which the future is planned and determined, but one in which the vast field of contingent risks to a person are somehow absorbed, in addition to hopefully ensuring them ongoing increases in capital. How does this relation to the future manifest itself in contemporary art? In contemporary art, time is bound, the future is written and absorbed by social algorithms of risk. The functional core of these algorithms can be summarized by the following. What kinds of affordances and what kinds of risks in the future do you present to me? The power ordering of the present of contemporary art prices its social relations, like derivatives, according to inferences of risk. The contingency of this time binding involves an ongoing metis of complicity. What can you do for me now? What might you be able to do for me in the future? What do others think that you might be able to do in the future that I could profit from both now and then? Should I trust you? What do you want from me? What will you want from me? As Benedict Singleton recently observed, the informal but not coalitions of operators in contemporary art more closely resemble the tentative cartel of Michael Mann's Heat or the permanent deracination of the Bourne identity rather than the old school mafia of The Godfather. Parties working in contemporary contingent concerts towards a common goal with individual interests that not only do not align, but which could potentially antagonize or threaten one another based on unforeseen events, or a non-stop mercenary plasticity that is able to assume new identities and acquire skill sets based on inferences from a situation in progress. Or, to look at it another way, contemporary art now constitutes something with the power of a nation-state without any of the regulations theoretically at play in its legal and political administration of norms. This aligns contemporary art as a social phenomenon with entities more on the order of Google and Facebook. So contemporary art as a social phenomenon then can be said to be, on some modest scale, tantamount to the modernity of finance qua derivatives and its dissolution of social norms and bonds, and the volatile renegotiations of the present based on the forecast of the future. To construct what Malik refers to as an exit from the time binding of contemporary art, I don't think that the solution is to reject or resist this particular modernity. Critique, especially self-secreted institutional critique, is all too well afforded by the cartel model. The possibility of the construction of an exit from this present has more to do with thought experiments issued by Ballard and Jameson, most recently taken up by Singleton in the Accelerationist Manifesto, to fully understand the current material production of the present and the future in order to find their overturning imminent to them. So, while I would say that in terms of the time binding of risk relationality, the price that hedges against social and financial volatility are the aforementioned networks, which are often referred to, without irony, as alliances. In contemporary art, this would be the convergence of public and private capital, along with cartel-like decision negotiation. The inversion of this condition is perhaps most movingly prefigured in George Lewis's book on the art ensemble of Chicago, A Power Stronger Than Itself. Lewis details the way in which the art ensemble of Chicago took full account of the relations at play in musical creativity. The association performed music written by all members. A formalized relationship between the older and younger generations were established, along with rights of interpolation. Meetings of the associations to discuss structural plans for the future were regular. Standards of conduct between musicians were established and enforced, and the musicians all considered the statecraft aspect of their practice, securing opportunities for its members, working with other more established institutions, to be not just an extension of, but an essential component to experimentation. Because time binding is a statist formation, the question of the present and the future of arts practice is bound up in the question of sovereignty. And here I'm kind of drawing upon Fred Moten's formation of sovereignty in his recent lecture, The Geographies of Collaboration show. So essentially, Moten argues that sovereignty from economic and social volatility and contingency is paradoxically found in the recognition that the subject already relies on others for his or her sense of self. That the recognition of, that a candor regarding the extent to which subjects rely on the complicity of others to have a future results in an increase in group power. Today, this would popularly be called transparency. But I think candor is actually a better term for it. And we can formulate this proposition as a different kind of sovereignty, a different kind of relation to the contingency of the future is established through candor, specifically the candor in our social, professional, and personal indebtedness to others. Perhaps one of the most quietly radical moments of recent memory is when, at a 2013 lecture, Greek Finance Minister Yanis Varoufakis tells an anecdote about being flown to Switzerland by a group of investment bankers as a consultant. Towards the end of the story, Varoufakis says, surveying the first-class section of the jet he was taken to for the summit, he was struck by the feeling that washed over him. I deserve this. Contemporary art discourse often tends to be naught but nothing other than the iteration of this logic. Perhaps the socio-discursive futurity of art is related to the cognitive technology of self-veracity. So what would the modernity qua finance future building of art's social dimension require? Generically speaking, it could look towards other time-binding technologies of contemporary finance, such as quantitative easing and proposals for universal basic income. What both QE and UBI address on similar terms but in radically different contexts is the necessity for a type of social insurance in order to maintain the livelihood of the state. However, we are not unaware that public projects in the arts, such as government arts councils that provide funding to private artists, are equally vulnerable and complicit in cartelization. That being said, in order for art to revivify its claim to social futurity, it needs to address the political economic conditions of its own production. If the current political economic sociality of contemporary art navigates and binds the contingency of the future in order to secure both wealth, but more importantly, capital, how would art after contemporary art do so? The ethic of such a project would require thinking through what it means materially to dissolve the contingency of aesthetic, social, and financial volatility in an even greater pool of contingency. On good days, I would call that something like unconditional love, but that's a kind of mess to get into. The contingency of unconditional support and equity. So one could read the way in which the vast majority of essay films produced under the sign of contemporary art exhibit an obsession with deactivated political projects as a symptom of contemporary art's inability to build a future for itself. Surely somewhere out there someone must have made it work at some point. The condition of possibility for such a formation can also be inferred from a contiguous aspect of contemporary technopolitics, that of transparency. The softening of the parastatus status of contemporary art that I described earlier would require art to avow its statehood and institutionality, and to subsequently make the economic makeup of that institutionality both transparent and readily available. If contemporary finance follows money into the future, art after contemporary art must first learn how to follow the money. Transparency also acts as the bridge between art's social future and the future of art practice. Namely, candor and transparency require rethinking of how attribution functions. While the economic questions raised previously are a matter of attribution, I completely agree with comments that Ray made back in the Glass Speed platform that collective work is the way forward. Such a shift in attributional geometries for art are tantamount to a naturalism of art's sense of self. Once one begins identifying the mechanisms and functions of how art is made, it becomes less and less tenable to attribute the creation of that work to an individual. As Robin McKay questioned at the Anonymous Materials Conference, if art is so interested in the material structure of forms, not only aesthetic, but subjective, scientific, sociological, and political, why are the people who've developed maximal understanding and manipulation of these forms so rarely invited to the table of contemporary art? And on the occasions that they are, why are their contributions almost always framed as theoretical alibis for the work on display? More to the point, the production of artworks, even modest, small-scale works made by single authors, are always relying upon the engineering expertise of technicians, mainly in the form of third-party tool use, including an expanded repertoire of emotional and affective registers. If anything, one of the contingencies that the futural time-binding of art must negotiate is the pendulum swing between the manifest and the scientific image, between what we continue to naturalistically learn and explicate about ourselves and the world, and the consequences of those findings for our psychological and epistemic metastability. Colombian mathematician, philosopher, and art critic Fernando Zalamea refers to this synthesis as razonabilidad, or expanded reason. Zalamea argues that a purely linguistic and/or discursive perspective divests us from apprehending complex images of the world. Rather, the transmodern methodology opens the space for and tracks the transits between that which can be said and that for which there is no sufficient language yet. Transmodernity, Zalamea writes, cannot be abandoned to unreason and the praising of vagueness. Appropriately for hybrids and mixtures, it should oscillate between an imagination every time more concrete and precise, and a reason every time more flexible and inventive. If the contingency of the future requires us to inhabit a permanent state of transit and flexibility, risk relations, art after contemporary art would allow us to know how sojourns to the borders have changed us, what risks await at the frontier, and how we might equitably cash out those risks as affordances.
Thank you, Brian. While you were speaking, if you allow me just to bring it to a very concrete example, I was reminded of Akram's project that he did for Documenta, the time capsule, which I'm sure you're familiar with, where he buried a set of images in the ground. When you were speaking about risk, I was thinking, wow, this is actually an interesting example of refusal to engage with risk in the future. So I was wondering what you would make of that gesture of actually, I mean, it's interesting in Akram's practice because it's the opposite of what he usually does. He usually excavates, he usually brings images to the surface brings them into the world and then also, of course, exposes them to risk. Well, here is actually the opposite, you know. I mean, it's too risky, the environment is too risky for these images to be seen. So what would you make of that type of gesture, like a refusal of engagement, let's say?
Yeah, I have to say that I'm skeptical of refusal as a kind of, the way refusal gets framed as a kind of radical political gesture, because eventually one does have to confront the kind of modernity of risk and the kind of inevitability of risk. So I don't really understand how an actual viable political project could really be formulated through that kind of hermetic refusal. I think it's a nice metaphorical gesture, but I don't really consider that to have any kind of practical efficacy, really. But again, I very sort of specifically avoided talking about particular artworks in this talk because I'm trying to look at more of a general logic of art. As soon as I point to a particular work of art and say that's it, that's not it, kind of divest the argument from any kind of power. Not to like refuse in the same breath as talking about how refusal is bad.
Questions, Ashley?
Thank you for this talk, Brian. I'll try to keep this short. A comment and a question. First of all, it looks like that in your theorization of contemporary art, the temporality of contemporary art sits comfortably with, or is comfortable with, or coincides with the world historical contemporaneity. Right? The world historical notion of contemporaneity as it's in late modernity that we are experiencing now. So there is no friction between the two. Second of all, I've been recently, I came across two texts, short texts by Dave Beach, who writes from London. And first of all, he discusses in his discussion of the politics and the apparatus of art. He talks about art as an institution that is much broader than other social institutions. He looks at it in terms of an apparatus. And in order to understand it, we have to engage with like the 7 categories that David Harvey proposes. Our, let's say, relationship to nature, relations of production, social relations of production, and so on and so forth, that provides a holistic kind of understanding of art as an institution. And within that, art emerges as a special kind of institution because of several factors. First of all, artistic labor never coincides exactly, or never is exactly aligned with the general notion of labor in general social technique. It's aligned and disaligned at the same time. And also, second of all, art never obeys the value form. So even if we discuss, let's say, art as a luxury product, it's never really a luxury product because it still upholds its sort of history of, or its humanistic values, right, of like public education, pedagogy. You can consume a yacht, but you can never entirely consume an artwork in that sense. So I'm wondering if within contemporary art itself, and its institution, as an institution in a broader understanding, there might be moments of non-coincidence, non-alignment that uphold the negativity that can be at the heart of a practice or an art object or an exhibition as a form. So is there hope within that of autonomy or criticality?
Maybe. I just haven't seen it yet. I don't think I would agree that art can't be consumed, or art... I don't agree that contemporary art can't as easily play the role of luxury good as a yacht can. Because yachts and, say, a Jeff Koons sculpture can do exactly the same kind of work, which is, basically it becomes a kind of metonym for social capital, right? If anything, I think that if there's hope for, an exit from contemporary art or art after contemporary art, I actually think it would need to divest itself from this ineffability, this kind of leftover, non-absorbed aspect. Because in some ways, I'm not trying to twist what you're saying, but in some ways it's to say, well, art can be useless, so therefore it's special somehow. That art doesn't get used up in the same way that other types of labor does, so therefore it gives it an honorific status amongst other types of labor. That to me doesn't seem like a very satisfying way of sort of advocating for art, really. I mean, I do think that what I do agree with is that art does, and when it's good, it produces its own forms of conception. Artists do think, artists do produce novel forms of concepts, but I don't think that those concepts enjoy any kind of particular privilege that other forms of conception or meaning making in particular.
Thanks for your talk. Brian, I had only one question. It's basically on your start, on the notion of risk and the risk society. You haven't mentioned this Beck's theory on this, but it's also not my question really. The idea would be more, if we conceive of the indebted man, what's Hartle called the indebted man, society that is indebted to the future, and there is the real future. So the future is already written and overwritten, thanks to obligations that we have in the present time and also in the past. What can we gain, or what is the insight that we have into that, let's say, debt and guilt nexus of the living, so to speak, when we call this, when we label it risk, since risk is an abstraction. So wherever what people risk is so different. So your example from the stock market is beautiful, since you can see that the actors or players of this very game risk almost nothing, since there will be a bailout. Others risk their lives in these kinds of economies. So it's kind of inscribed as asymmetry of debt relations. It's totally abstracted once we have created a perspective of risk, an almost mathematical formula, which is at best, sometimes 50-50, or we cannot calculate, but it's kind of matter of statistics. So, to what extent we buy into the perspective of those who play this game and render this as risk. Everyone has risk. There are people. There's also a setting point of assurances. Life is risky, right? But what is at stake? So I would like to push you a bit further towards the limits of the concept of risk and what we actually risk ideologically while buying into these kind of abstractions.
Yeah, I think that a risk society isn't necessarily, you're right that on the one hand it is an ideology that gets espoused by people who work on the stock market. At the same time, I think that there is real social reordering that happens as a result of a kind of paradigm of risk relations. So for sure there are layers of kind of the causal fabric where that gets instantiated at different levels and in different ways. But I think that it becomes, in a way it's kind of a metaphorical tool. And so I'm not quite sure what your question is. But I don't know. I guess I just see it as a way of understanding the dissolution of the types of social contracts and normativities that come to be taken for granted. And so how does one develop an ethics when that's a situation that even if you don't necessarily believe in the ideology, it's still a situation that you find yourself involved in. So do you refuse it, or do you acknowledge it as a paradigm that we live in and find a more ethical way of navigating it?
Any more questions, Brian?
Very good.
Oh. Go ahead.
Okay. It was a very specific question regarding this issue of transparency. I wondered, I was curious about the opinion of Brian about the ArtLeaks platform. So ArtLeaks is a collective platform initiated by an international group of artist curators, art historians and intellectuals in response to the abuse of their professional integrity and the open infraction of their labor rights. And they're doing a campaign where they're sort of hijacking the WikiLeaks model to address these kind of forms of misconduct in the art world. So I'm quite curious what you think of this initiative.
Yeah, I think it's necessary but not sufficient. I think ArtLeaks is great, but at the same time, it's only the beginning. It's one thing to make the information available and transparent, and that's probably where something has to begin, but I don't think by sheer dint of the information being available that somehow something therefore happens just by all of us warming our hands around the fire of our mutual indignation. that somehow that has to become the basis for, you know, very concrete sort of political demands within the field of art. So I think they're fantastic, absolutely, but I also think it's only really the beginning.
Do you have any ideas about how this could be extended? Did you have any, did you think that through? Are you ready to say something about that?
No, I don't have anything optimistic to say.
I saw a question over there as well.
You mentioned at the beginning that there were these systems of time binding, and they're multiple, but how open, I mean, some of them will be nested within one another, and is there, I mean, basically, does something like capital, kind of, are all these different, you know, time binding systems now subordinated to one kind of, you know, dominant system, you know, the value form? I mean, it's a kind of Marxist question. So the market itself, I mean, what's its relationship to the capitalist mode of production? Or would that have to be factored into this account as well? Or do you have, is that something you have to get an objection in principle to?
I mean, I feel like, well, you know, the theorizations of the market that I'm drawing on are they're pretty distinctly non-Marxist formulations. It's really coming out of Nietzsche and Bouwhuis's work in Capital is Power. And, you know, that really kind of does away with a lot of the, like, Marxist categories of labor value. You know, really just sets up quite a simple equation, which is price is power, right? So I think that, you know, price is really the kind of, like, minimal ordering factor. Yeah, but absolutely I think that there are nested aspects of, basically nested aspects of time binding, definitely. But I don't know if there would necessarily be like a meta power ordering. You know, I think that would require maybe a more naturalistic account rather than an economic one.
So what's the position? This is what I didn't get. We live in a risk society. Artworks are prized, if you want it or not. These are the premises or not?
Not really, but yeah.
What are the premises?
Well, the talk is the premises, but I guess generally that art as a kind of like social discursive phenomenon is ordered according to risk relations and ordered according to risk, and that the demands and the politics of that risk also binds what becomes possible or permissible in it as an art practice.
Okay, so the risk situation is affecting the art production.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So after what is then the is there a position you take in relation to that? You want to disjoin this relation, or you find what's the consequences of that?
No, I actually think that you know, an exit from contemporary art would require, you know, a certain kind of owning up to the way in which the, you know, social relations in art condition the possibilities, the aesthetic or conceptual possibilities within art. So no, I don't think that there needs to be a reseparation. If anything, there needs to be a reconciliation and a truthfulness about that state.
Which means they should just recognize that this is the case.
That's a start.
Yeah, to say that yes, we are affected by the art market.
We can start there, sure.
Okay. Is there a next step, or?
I have no answers. I'm just,
okay.
Yeah, I have no answers.
Okay, just for me to get that's all.
Perhaps a last question, if there is any. Okay. If not, thank you so much, Brian, for your paper. And unfortunately, Ursula Frohne could not make it to Beirut due to unforeseen circumstances. So what I'm going to do is circulate a page where you can put your email on, and then Angela will make sure you will get her actual talk. So, and I suggest we break for 10 minutes and then continue with Aras Ozgun's lecture performance. He needs to set up, so see you in about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Was there anything interesting you learned from him?
Yeah, I mean, I disagree with the comments that
Yeah.
You know, which is a weird.
So was he saying that he was talking about the art market?
Yeah,
that what was it?
Yeah, but he was. Yeah, I think he's just using this discourse. It's not critical of the market.
Right. No, I actually like that move.
I
like that move. I don't know.
Okay.
I like it just as a possibility. I don't mean that I like it.
No, sure, from within you. Like what
no, that's right. I just like that. I like the iconoclasm of that move. Just suddenly, like what would happen? But I mean, if it gives something interesting, it sounds. It's like I would be if he kind of said that. I'd say, right, I want to see what happens next. It doesn't sound like it does. What happens next? That's it. I mean, you understand, I'm not saying that I agree with it in any move, I'm just saying I like the idea of that radical step, that kind of steps outside of the framework that says, well, what would happen if, say as a first move, I'm not sure what would happen. I don't know, that's up to him to do that. That's up to him to do the work. I mean, if it might, who knows, it might result in something spectacular, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I refuse it. But then his solution, which is, it would be a good start,
is the essence of a living existence.
That's meaningless. It's like, oh, so we should. Yeah, right, exactly. Oh, so we have to, but the last thing you want is an artwork that problematizes those social issues. Like that's totally dumb and interesting. You don't want that. Yeah, right.
I'm going to bring Leila into this.
Yeah.
Yes.
They're not. So,
Rico, sorry, do you want to get Ursula's